let's use some of the concepts we've learned to understand what happens in a market where there is trade. So a lot of markets like oil, minerals, machinery, commodities, these are all traded on world markets. So what happens in these types of markets in the long run? So let's denote by S of P the total world supply. So this is the total world market supply of some good. Let's denote by DO of P the total demand outside of some given country. So we're doing this analysis from the perspective of some particular country. Let's say we're doing this from the perspective of Canada. So this is all the demand from countries outside, other than Canada. So the residual supply for Canadian consumers is very similar to the idea of residual demand that we defined earlier, which is the total supply minus the demand from everybody else. So the idea here is what is left over for Canadian consumers given world supply and what other consumers are demanding. So the world is at the price P, all the suppliers in the world together give us this much. Let's call it S. All the other consumers in other countries other than Canada demand this much, DO. So what's left over of this supply is S minus DO. And that's what we call the residual supply for the consumers in the country that we're doing the analysis from the perspective of, like Canada. So the supply from Canadian consumers' perspective, it's as if the supply were just SR. So let's look at an example. Let's say when the DO is this curve here, and S is this curve here, and the equilibrium should the country that we're doing the analysis from the perspective of not exist, then the equilibrium would be the quantity 32 and the price 850. So if there's no demand from our perspective, then the equilibrium price would be 850. Phrased differently, at the price 850, the total quantity supplied by all the suppliers in the world is 32. The total quantity demanded by all the consumers outside of Canada is 32. So what's left over is 0. So the residual supply at the price 850 is 0. What's the residual supply at the price? Let's take 935, for example. Well, we look at the demand, which is 30. We look at supply from all the suppliers, which is 34. So what's left over is 4. So the residual supply at 935 is 4. Now we could do this at every possible price. Of course, at any price less than 850, the residual supply is 0. At any price above 850, we're going to get some positive residual supply. So what we can do is to plot this residual supply. Of course, at 850, we get 0. At 935, we get 4. And then for every price above 850, we get some number. What we see, though, is that this residual supply is a whole lot flatter than the market supply. This should remind you of the residual demand that a single firm faces. It's the same idea. It's just supply rather than demand. So we might want to know, in order to understand, for example, if you wanted to know what would happen if we impose a tax on this good in Canada, we might want to know what the residual supply is and be able to estimate the elasticity of residual supply. So let's look at this residual supply and calculate the elasticity of residual supply. Before we do that, let's let theta, the Greek letter theta, represent the share of the world's supply that is consumed in Canada. So QR divided by Q. So the total amount consumed around the world is Q. QR is the share that we consume, is the amount that we consume. So our share, the proportion of the world's supply of this good that we consume, is QR over Q. Eta is the market supply elasticity. Epsilon O is the demand elasticity of everyone else. So it's the elasticity of DO. What we find is that eta R, so the elasticity of residual supply, is eta divided by theta minus 1 minus theta over theta epsilon O. The way you'd find this is very similar to the way we calculated the elasticity of residual demand. We won't go through the details. But if we did, for example, want to calculate the elasticity of residual supply, and we knew that the supply elasticity was a half, and the demand elasticity for the rest of the world was negative 0.7. So according to the textbook, these are the estimates for world cotton. If you're a country that consumes a fairly small proportion of the world's cotton, so let's think of a country that consumes only 0.1% of all the cotton in the world. If we plugged in 1% for 0.1% for theta and half for eta and minus 0.7 for epsilon O, we would find that the supply elasticity of the residual supply is almost 1200. So it's very elastic. Even though the supply elasticity of the market supply is actually not that high. It's quite low. So these consumers face a very, very flat supply curve. Now let's compare that with the country that consumes quite a large proportion, almost a fifth of the world supply. So if we plug that in, so we plug 18.5% for theta with the same values of eta and epsilon O, we would find that the residual supply would actually be only 5.8. So it's far less elastic. So consumers in this country would face an upward sloping curve, while consumers in this country face a flat supply curve. Knowing what the elasticity is helpful if you wanted to do things like estimate the impact of taxes and so forth, as we've seen before. So the tools we've developed so far help us understand these kinds of things.